It's my pleasure to introduce Julian Zelizer as our speaker today. Julian is one of the leading political historians of our time. You'll find him quoted frequently in the New York Times and elsewhere. I first met Julian in 2008 when I was starting the CNN opinion section and was looking for a commentator who could remark on the unusual fact that we had two senators running against each other for president, Barack Obama and John McCain. And it was relatively rare to have even one senator running. And I called the historian of the United States Senate and asked him for a recommendation of a historian, and he immediately suggested Julian. And we did, in fact, commission that piece and published it. It was a huge hit with our readers, and he became a regular columnist for CNN Opinion and a CNN political analyst. His ability to recall the whole of American political history going back more than a century is extremely impressive. And of course, he writes about it very lucidly. And Julian has gone on to write a column for Foreign Policy. He appears regularly on NPR. In total, he has written more than 1,000 opinion pieces. And you can sign up for his insightful Substack called The Long View. And for his day job, Julian is the Malcolm Forbes Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's authored or edited 23 books. His book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, won the D.B. Hardeman Prize for the best book on Congress. Burning Down the House, which was the story of Newt Gingrich and the Republicans who took over Congress, was named as one of the 100 notable books of 2020 by the New York Times. And after every presidential administration for the last 20 years, Julian has convened a panel of historians to do an assessment. And he's done that for Obama and for Biden, and he did one for the first administration of Donald Trump, which was published in 2022. And I think he'll tell you the story of how he wound up talking with Donald Trump. And we can't wait to hear what Julian and his fellow historians think of Trump's second term. Julian, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Eileen. And Rich and I have a close connection, so it's really wonderful to be introduced by him. He's a superb editor who helped me really develop into who I am today. So thank you. And it's also great to be part of this organization and to be speaking to all of you. So you have all heard the news. The president refused to spend money that was allocated to a program to protect the environment. He refused to use money that Congress had explicitly authorized for specific purposes, in part to promote an agenda and in part to assert his power over Congress. The president insisted that he had the right to do this. After all, he has reminded the public presidents since Thomas Jefferson have been impounding money, so why can't he do the same? His advisors were not subtle in defending him. The president's view is that he has the right to impound those funds, one of his advisors said to the press. The Senate Majority Leader was livid about this. The intent of Congress has been flouted, and this question must be faced up to and a solution found, even if it means going to the Supreme Court. The president complained that the media and the press were making such a big deal of all of this. The so-called opinion leaders in this country, he said, don't get the necessity to stand by the President of the United States when he makes difficult decisions. The president already hated the press from his first term, complaining that he had suffered the most devastating attacks on TV. Fortunately, in this particular case, the courts stepped in to save the program. The story, though, is not about President Trump. This story took place in 1972. The legislation was the Clean Water Act. The Senate Majority Leader was Mike Mansfield, and the President was Richard Nixon. In other words, the nation has wrestled with the problem that we have faced in recent months before, an imperial presidency. Indeed, this country was founded in a revolt against centralized power. Since the 1770s, the fight against leaders who abuse their power and ignore any kind of system of constraint has been an ongoing problem in American politics. As George Washington forewarned in his farewell address, it is important that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration, to confine themselves within respective constitutional spheres, avoiding the exercise of the powers of one department to encourage upon the other, Washington said. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus create whatever form of government a real despotism. The early 1970s marked one of the most intense struggles over this issue that we had seen in American history, culminating, of course, in Nixon's dramatic resignation in August of 1974. In retrospect, we sometimes think of the outcomes of battles like Watergate as inevitable. But as we can see in our own lifetime, history is contingent, and the victor of any struggle is rarely evident until one side is victorious. There are many ways in which Nixon could have survived. We have learned recently, in recent years, how strong Republican support remained for Nixon, really until the summer of 1974, both in the electorate and on Capitol Hill. Other commentators have rightly noted that if Nixon had some parts of the press that exist today, including very partisan kind of opinion platforms, he might very well have survived the investigations and the scrutiny. One of the most important parts of Nixon's story over presidential power is who imposed the guardrails, who stepped up at that moment to ensure that the abuse of power did not continue, who stepped up to ensure that the Constitution survived. And legendary, as all of you know, among them, and to much of the public, thanks to classic films like All the President's Men, was the news media. Though the narrative of the 1970s has traditionally centered on Woodward and Bernstein, again, most of you in this room know it was a period where there was a much bigger media project that took place in print, on television, and even on radio. A generation of dogged reporters who emerged even in intimidating times to cover this story. Despite many moments when it was possible that pressures would have led them to stop, including after the 1972 election, many of them, enough of them, continued to pursue the question of, was the White House not only connected to the break-in at the Watergate complex in June of '72, but did we have a president who was not fit to serve in that position? As the investigation unfolded, with the courts and Congress broadening the range of issues that Nixon had been involved with, the coverage expanded as well. Many consider this a high point in American journalism, a moment when the press's role and the preservation of the constitutional order were tightly linked, culminating in not only the downfall of a president who acted imperially, but also in a decade of resurgence of congressional power and reform. What can we learn about the role of the press in that period and today, as the nation once again, I would argue, confronts a very serious threat to the system? Every generation of journalists has different challenges that they need to overcome. Back in the 1970s, two of the biggest, one was secrecy in politics, and second were some of the professional norms that had been born out of the 20th century. In terms of secrecy, the early 1970s was still a period where Formal and informal mechanisms that protected elected officials and information from the public were incredibly strong. Disclosure and sunshine laws were minimal. Public expectations about what politicians needed to reveal and what the press should reveal were often still very low. And there were many spaces where powerful politicians could act outside of public scrutiny. Some of this was born out of the massive expansion of the national security state during the Cold War in the 1940s. Others were just part of the culture of the 1960s and 70s. In terms of professional norms, a second challenge was the norm of objectivity, which came out of early 20th century journalism as the profession took hold. There's a great book, Discovering the News, by a scholar named Michael Schudson about this, and those norms really pushed reporters to stay away from too much analysis and to contain themselves in the kinds of stories that they put back. There was constant pushback against journalism that went too far, not only in making assertions, but even for some kinds of investigation. Some of this was enforced by public policy on television and radio. The Fairness Doctrine that started in 1949 kind of pushed producers away from having too much of this kind of reporting. Often investigative reporters before the 1970s had been marginalized as gossip columnists, or even worse, irresponsible partisan agitators, only interested in smear and bringing down leaders unfairly. The syndicated columnists Drew Pearson, for example, and Jack Anderson both faced this kind of criticism all the time. But in the early 70s, the press overcame both of these and produced the coverage that became an essential part of the history of Watergate. Today, we face an imperial presidency once again. The president has weaponized the Department of Justice to go after his opponents while enacting a massive, unpredictable, and unstable tariff program based on claims of emergency power, through which he maintains a very strong hand on the economy. He's pressured individual law firms, universities, and media organizations into deals with threats of federal money, threats of regulatory action if they don't abide. There are federal troops and federalized National Guards that have been on the streets and are in the streets of major cities, and the creation of a deportation process that has rounded up documented and undocumented persons without due process. The confluence of the president's business interests and his political interests are almost perfect, impossible to see a line anymore between the two. And the Trump family has been amassing significant wealth from what we're learning as a result of his presidency. Memories of how worried some Americans were that overseas leaders were paying for rooms and holding meetings at the Trump Hotel during the first term seem quaint compared to what is going on with cryptocurrency, media assets, and real estate overseas. In contrast to 1974, it's not hard to follow the money this time around. It goes right to the White House. The president, through redistricting, pressuring for redistricting, and attacks on voting right laws, is threatening the midterm and next presidential election. And when he can't pressure the Republican majority in the House and Senate into doing what he wants, we have seen how he acts through executive orders, sometimes first articulated not on a document but on Truth Social. Regarding the 22nd Amendment, the president keeps making jokes, as he tends to do before he does something that he'll be running again. A lot has changed since the early 1970s, and much of it for the better, and we need to remember that, including for the press. In the wake of Watergate, for instance, Congress imposed a series of reforms that created clearer boundaries for evaluating whether a president was going too far. In 1973, the War Powers Act created more restrictions on what presidents could do without congressional consent. In 1974, a major budget reform legislation granted legislators more muscle in terms of shaping the outcome of budgets. In 1978, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act created a FISA court and limitations on what kinds of surveillance could be conducted on American citizens. Congress passed an Ethics Reform Act in 1978 that included financial disclosure rules for executive branch officials, and of course created an independent counsel which has expired. The value of the right to know, as Michael Schudson wrote in another book, drove a lot of the reforms in the 1970s and was essential to the press. The importance of sunshine and disclosure laws has made it easier for the press to understand what is going on. The Presidential Records Act of 1978 imposed rules on what presidents and executive branch officials could do with valuable material. Campaign finance reforms from 1974 vastly strengthened the disclosure laws, so we know much more about where money is coming from and where it is going. Together, the reforms created a more porous, transparent, and open political system. Journalism has also changed in ways that have left the institution better positioned to handle the challenge of the moment. Investigative journalism and reporting became permanently entrenched after the Watergate scandal, producing a constant stream of publications devoted to uncovering how power was being abused. While there are many problems with the press, which I'm going to discuss in a few minutes, there have also been advances we need to appreciate and remember. Far more diversity in media outlets, greater opportunities for unestablished reporters now to break stories, more transparencies within the newsroom, and vastly more information that is available quickly to journalists as they cover what is happening in Washington. Though there is ongoing debate about how much analysis is desirable, the old rigid devotion to objectivity for its own sake at all costs has weakened, opening up some richer and often more nuanced kind of coverage. Yet despite these improvements, it's also fair to argue that the media, reporting, journalism, is facing massive challenges in covering this president in 2025. So let me go through a few of them. Let's begin with what's being called the attention economy of modern communication. MSNBC reporter Chris Hayes wrote a very good book called The Siren's Call, which puts his finger on a very challenging element of contemporary politics and the contemporary media, the struggle to capture and retain the attention of readers and viewers. In the era of smartphones, attention spans are short. It is common to scroll through the headlines, moving on after a few seconds rather than taking time to really consider, digest, and understand complex issues. In many corners, the long-form article has been displaced by the TikTok video. The fragmentation of popular culture, where everyone can stream whatever they want and whenever they want, makes it easier for people to tune out politics altogether, even if the best coverage is taking place. The current media ecosystem has struggled to generate the kind of sustained attention that an earlier crisis like Watergate could still command. In the summer of 1973, somewhere between 150 to 200 million viewers tuned in every day to watch the Watergate hearings when Senator Sam Erving, conducted the famous congressional investigation. Even if those hearings were to take place today, which it's hard to imagine that happening, it is difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that they could draw the same kind of sustained engagement or numbers from viewers. If you can't be heard, Chris Hayes wrote, it doesn't matter what you say. And right now, it's both easier than ever to shout and harder than ever to be heard. The paradox defines what modern journalism faces and has made it extremely difficult to stay ahead of President Trump as he exercises power with a strong hand. Trust in media outlets has also plummeted, while commercial pressures often leave these organizations moving from one story to the other in search of clicks, content, and viewers. Gallup's most recent poll, I believe, found that public trust in the news media to produce accurate information has fallen to its lowest level in 5 decades. Only about 31% of Americans say they trust the mainstream media a great deal or a fair amount, slightly less than the 36% who say they don't trust it at all. This is not to say there aren't fantastic journalists out there doing good work. Many are my friends. Still, they operate in an environment that makes it hard for a story to stick in the same way Woodward and Bernstein were able to make their coverage stick. The era when Woodward and Bernstein's reporting could spark shared national conversations, water cooler moments, so to speak, has long passed. Today, even the water cooler has been displaced by the individualized water bottle. Attempting to convey the enormity of presidential actions has also, ironically, been made more difficult by the legacy of both Vietnam and Watergate, meaning the ongoing impact of those two scandals in eroding trust in all of our institutions creates a situation where it's hard for many Americans to understand what is a red flag and what is not. We've seen so many political controversies with the gate affixed to their description that I think sometimes the public is a bit numb, even when dramatic events are happening right before their eyes. Trying to convince readers and viewers when something is precedented, unprecedented, dangerous, or tolerable, a breaking point, or survivable is very hard when readers and viewers see so much with a cynical eye. The media is also struggling with the long-term commercialization of the industry, a transformation that has produced several compounding effects. As the news became more of a commercial enterprise in the age of cable, some would argue with the launch of CNN in 1980 as a key turning point, pressures to earn revenue, attract viewers, and produce fast-moving content have intensified. Though ownership is consolidated, the choices available to any news consumer have actually increased dramatically and fragmented, and with so many alternatives, it's hard to get stories that will work across different platforms. Commercial pressures to stay afloat create incentives sometimes for certain types of coverage, disincentives for other kinds of coverage. Stories about presidential power and governance sometimes lack sensational appeal, and they can easily fall by the wayside. I think this has been particularly true with a lot of the conflict of interest stories that have come out about the White House. Just as important, the changes in media ownership create new vulnerabilities, as we are now seeing, for a president to bully and intimidate these organizations. Now that so many outlets are owned by large corporations with commercial interests from Amazon to Disney, the pressure points for a presidential administration are greater than ever. Even without direct presidential pressure, as some of you here know, boardroom considerations about what to publish or air might not always align anymore with what's best for the public interest. Then there is the Trump effect. Flooding the zone with scandal is central to his presidential style. He batters the nation's senses, smashing through one guardrail after another without pause. In doing so, he, like the legacy of Watergate and Vietnam, numbs the country's political senses, leaving many citizens unable to know when they are reading something, is this a break-the-glass moment? Finally, there is the enormous transformation of how news is transmitted, which not only are politicians trying to keep up with, but I think many reporters as well. I think that some of our best and most experienced outlets are still often playing catch-up to the world of Instagram, TikTok, podcasting, and more. Ask any person under their 30s and certainly below their 20s where they get their news. Few turn into cable television. few read the newspapers online or in print. Most are scrolling through their phones when they are getting news at all. While there have been significant improvements, I think, in many outlets in trying to reach new audiences, certainly the New York Times, for example, with their podcasting has made, I think, pretty big advances. NPR did as well, and other news outlets like Crooked Media have tried to figure out how to communicate news. In this era, there's still a big disconnect that we face between the highest quality coverage and the platforms where they will receive the biggest audiences. If people are receiving their news through TikTok scrolls and algorithmic feeds, it's unclear always if the best reporting will reach their screens. In our current moment, thus, covering the Imperial Presidency is very difficult. I certainly can't speak for all journalists, but I can share a little bit of what I'm trying to do and kind of building on some very good work out there. The most important for me has been to try to situate contemporary events, as dizzying as they might be, including the expansion of presidential power, in some kind of long-term continuum, which is what I do with my students in class. Too much of the coverage unfolds minute by minute, making it harder to separate the wheat from the chaff. Some of the reporters who excel at this, I think, are people like Peter Baker at the New York Times or Frank Foyer at the Atlantic, journalists who help place the now into perspective, moving people beyond the constant feed and stream of breaking news that they face. This is at the heart of the book series that Rich mentioned in the introduction. Happy to talk about the conversation with President Trump that I did for the book on him later. Without this kind of coverage, I think, it becomes very hard to know when are we in a moment when we really need to see that something has gone in a dangerous or destabilizing direction in Washington. You know, on this point, I do urge, I think some of the interactions, and it's not a plug, but I think one of the kind of useful elements of what some journalists are doing is trying to connect social sciences and the academy to what journalists do. Ezra Klein does a very good job, I think. Whatever people think of his political perspective, he does a terrific job at bringing in this kind of information to help make sense of what's happening. Another way journalists can improve their reporting on the Imperial Presidency, I believe, is through a comparative perspective. We have seen excellent reporting on the rise of autocratic regimes in parts of Europe, on conservative populism, on anti-immigration movements that's taking place around the globe. Coverage that situates American politics within a global context. Like understanding the past, this kind of discussion, I believe, throws light on what's happening right here. Moreover, much of politics is no longer national. It's taking place through dynamics, whether it's at the media, whether it's about immigration, which cuts across nation states. There's also the need in journalism for clarity and candor. One of the most significant criticisms I felt of the coverage of the first Trump presidency was the dangers of what people called both-siderisms, a tendency among some journalists to try to balance every statement in a way that actually blurred the reality of how different elements of the political system weren't working in the same way. In this case, one of the kind of ways in which you saw this was in coverage of polarization and partisanship, which I write about in the book, which is available downstairs. But the point was, when you spoke or wrote about polarization and just talked about the parties moving farther apart and not having a center, you missed the ways in which the two parties were partisan in very different ways. The Republicans had become much more aggressive in their style of partisanship. The Republicans had been much more willing to break through guardrails that still existed on the Democratic side, and that we were talking about two very different parties. Steve Bannon famously said in 2017, I believe, that Democrats come for a pillow fight and Republicans come for the head wound. And that asymmetry was important, I think, when reporters were covering what did partisanship look like, not as a normative statement, but as a realistic understanding of how we had two parties operating in different ways. This also applies to presidential power. It took time in the first term for the press to just say when President Trump was lying, was saying something that was categorically not true, or to describe actions that went beyond what we had seen from other presidents. And I think there's been actually some backsliding since January, with some fear because of all the pressures I talked about, or reporters not wanting to appear partisan in the way that the administration has conveyed them as partisan, to not often be as direct as they need to. All of this, I think has created some pressures that journalists are facing today, but years from now, as historians look on the period, they'll be able to see this with much greater clarity. Finally, the platforms are everywhere. For too long, many of the best journalists dismissed how younger Americans consumed information. Now it's essential to find creative and credible ways to reach them where they are. I mentioned TikTok earlier. I heard some laughs, and that always happens. But we have to take the TikTok seriously. We have to take the scroll seriously. We have to take the Instagram seriously. We have to figure out, how do you bring the news to the places where people are going to consume them when they're under 30. We've seen these challenges in American journalism before. In 1954, Edward R. Murrow demonstrated the power of television in an era it was still often dismissed, as you'll hear from David next week in his coverage of Senator McCarthy on See It Now. Half a century later, a new generation of bloggers like Ezra Klein or Matt Iglesias and others figured out in the early 2000s how blogging could actually provide good information and analysis about reporting. As a historian of American politics, I do believe the United States is facing one of the greatest constitutional challenges that we have seen in its history, with power being wielded this aggressively, with this intensity. Much is under threat. It will take all of our institutions to bring us to a safe landing, and it will take sustained public pressure to make sure that the president's allies understand the risks of an anything-goes kind of politics. Among the institutions we will now count on is the press. In 1973, the historian and philosopher of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, told an interviewer, "The moment we no longer have a free press, anything can happen. What makes it happen for a totalitarian or any other dictatorship to rule is that people are not informed. How can you have an opinion if you are not informed? If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. This is because lies, by their very nature, have to be changed, and a lying government constantly rewrites its own history. On the receiving end, you get not only one lie, a lie, she wrote, which you could go on for the rest of your days, but you get a greater number of lies, depending on how the political wind blows. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please." Just as was the case with Watergate, journalism must continue to tell the story of our times. The press must provide citizens with the information they need to understand and evaluate what's happening in Washington, and to envision possible paths towards stabilizing the political system as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. That declaration warned us at the start that to secure the rights outlined in a revolt against monarchy, it was essential to ensure, quote, "governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." When we no longer have that, when the government becomes, quote unquote, destructive to those ends, the Declaration stated, we are in a crisis. Thank you for listening. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this association. I look forward to our conversation.
Marcy Brownson. Professor Zelizer.
Yes.
leaving aside all the other excellent points you've made and focusing in only on TikTok, imagine that Indivisible and 51 and some of the organizations that a lot of us probably belong to, imagine that they combined to make recommendations for seniors and for their other people who follow them to take action steps to sign up for TikTok, go on TikTok, and surreptitiously invade the brains of the younger people. What can we literally do on TikTok to have our influence grow?
Well, so Indivisible that you brought, so the co-founder of Indivisible was my student. So I've talked to him many times as this has unfolded. I even interviewed him on my Substack, Ezra 11. They use it. I mean, so they are very clear on kind of trying to articulate not only where protests are going to take place, as an example, but really to communicate some of these issues that go beyond Democratic or Republican positions, really about, you know, the dangers of power. And they're you can look at Ezra's on TikTok, and he's very good at sending out short, effective messages. I think journalists do something different. Ezra's an activist. He's not a journalist. But some of the stories of all the different issues that we've talked about, like what is happening in deportation, you can have an 800-word long article or opinion piece or a 500-word coverage, but you can also have a 10-second video that really conveys, either through an image of a person or through kind of a snappy, here's 10 points, that's how young people will pay attention to it, pure and simple. They will not, and I say this with all respect to the New York Times, they won't read the New York Times article. They'll listen to the podcast, so they'll see it that way. So journalists can kind of figure out how do you take your piece and how do you boil it down to something like that. A big thing on TikTok, which I don't use TikTok, I mean, I'm on it, but I'm not a generation from that, is, and the current mayoral candidate did this effectively, whatever you think of him, he did it effectively in the campaign. He did the interviews on the street. Like, you remember he walked up and down the street and he was interviewing halal owners and small business owners, and people love this thing. And part of what he was doing, and people of my generation older didn't get this, that's how you do TikTok. That's the man on the street, the person on the street interview. And I could imagine good reporting that uses that quick format in terms of any of these issues to try to get people interested. Those are the kinds of things I think we need to do more of.
Tony Guide, during your talk you listed a menu of acts, bills, whatever, that Congress passed in the 70s and 80s to sort of protect us from imperial or abuse of power. So what? We haven't heard anything about any of them since, and does anybody even care that all these things are there? I mean, why isn't some of that being used to fight back?
I think they weren't perfect. Some fell by the wayside, like the War Powers Act did not work as intended. Although there's still restrictions that for many decades mattered to how presidents thought of when to deploy troops, a lot of them did matter. The Watergate reforms on campaign finance actually were pretty effective. Until Obama and Bush, we had a public finance system for presidential elections that the candidates did, and it limited the amount of private money in campaigns. The disclosure rules really matter. All of you who write about campaigns and campaign finance have access to information that in the 1950s you would have had to go to the office of the clerk of the House, look through some dusty files, and hopefully find something that can tell you where the money was coming from. So that's an important reform. The ethics rules on the executive branch still are in place. And I understand the current administration is stretching and violating them, but they are there. They are expectations that we can't simply say don't matter. They are some baseline that we can have a conversation about what's going wrong. So right now, why aren't they working? I think you have a Republican majority that is totally loyal to the preservation of the power of the party. And in their mind, that means to the preservation of Donald Trump. And when you have that, what we have seen in Republican politics is a willingness to abandon other concerns, a willingness to abandon concerns of governance, a willingness to abandon concerns of the health of our institutions, and all of that is why I think this is happening. I'm not an activist, I'm not a political strategist, but really kind of breaking that total loyalty is the key for Democrats and the key for those who oppose this kind of power, because once he doesn't have Capitol Hill, the president actually would be much weaker. Congress has a lot of power. They have a lot of authority. Those rules are still in place. They just have to use it. And what's going to get them to move, I think, is the electoral incentives don't look good anymore. Meaning the minute Trump is a cost rather than a benefit, I still think you can get Republicans to change their position. It's crass, but that's how politics works. The last thing I would say is, look, there's the short term and the long term. I can hear the jokes. I hope we have a long term. I believe we will. But I do think there's a conversation when this is over, this particular presidency is finished, in terms of reform. I mean, one of the most interesting parts of the 70s is what happened after Watergate. And those changes were very significant, I still think. And reform is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing. You pass reforms, they weaken, you pass them again. But we're going to have another moment of reform. Some of what the president has exposed is not just about him. It's not just about his administration. It's about vulnerabilities in our political system that we didn't take seriously. The Insurrection Act right now is the one you're going to hear a lot about. And it's kind of unconscionable that we have a piece of legislation that doesn't define what an insurrection is at all. And it then gives the president so much power. There's been efforts over the years to get people to be interested in this. They might be more interested in the next few months. But I think that's one very specific area of reform that has to be on the table, limiting that, defining it, making it clear when troops can or can't be used without the consent of elected officials in states or localities.
Michael Searle, former Silurians president and longtime foreign editor. I think one of the things we've learned over the last 10 months is the extent to which we operated under an honor system.
Yes.
That their previous presidents just were exercising self-restraints and not deciding to close down agencies, to politicize various processes, to take over the Department of Justice as their own. That it could have happened, but there was a kind of restraint, an honor system that was in place, unlegislated, that kept things in balance. Want to comment on that?
It's a great point, and it's something I have thought a lot about, which I myself, even as a historian who's written about presidents, who's written about Congress in many periods, didn't think enough about. And I think in the first term, I was already becoming more aware of how much really norms is what you're talking about. That norms guide and limit some of the behavior, both of presidents, of other people in political office, and we depend on those norms. Part of what you do in an election is not just vote on the person with the policy preferences that are most aligned with you, but in some way you trust that they know when too far has been reached. And I think what President Trump realizes, you can say effectively, dangerously, whatever your political position, but you can violate those norms, and that was all that was holding a person back. The Constitution's imperfect. The Constitution depended, even with the separation of powers, even with federalism and the impeachment, it depended on certain norms being upheld. And you're right. And so there's not an easy solution to that. I mean, look, disclosure and financial conflict of interest reforms in 78 did deal with some of that. The point was, we can't count on everyone not to take money from the wrong people and not to act. We need rules on the books, and there can be more of that for sure. But some of it is always going to depend on the democratic decision that this nation makes of who they empower. And thinking carefully about people who will understand when they have to stop. Even the Department of Justice, we have these Watergate, post-Watergate reforms which created a separation between DOJ and the Oval Office. There were rules in the internal rule book of Department of Justice that were put into place. All communication with the White House had to go through the Attorney General, and there were rules about what you could, but it was still at some level the norms of the president and the norms of the Attorney General, that they would uphold those and that they would limit it. Those are broken now. I think that's clear. And so you're right. And so I agree. And I think that's a big part of where we are in politics, is not just reestablishing rules, reestablishing law, it's reestablishing norms that we depend on.
Leslie Wayne, New York Times alum. You said that you had an interview with President Trump. Could you tell us about that?
And you in a room full of reporters, someone would catch that. So I've done these volumes on the president that Rich talked about. I actually started with George W. Bush, and it's been really rewarding and interesting. So I did one on President Trump when his presidency ended, and the way it works, I get historians. They're usually not the TV historians you see. They're actually people who don't even work on the presidency. It's like someone who does immigration. I have them write, how do we understand what happened in the Trump years in terms of immigration long term? And so they all write a draft, and I always have a conference. Usually it's in person. We get together for 3 days. We comment on the chapters, and then we go to the final stage for production. So I did it with the Trump book, and we did the conference on Zoom because it was still COVID, 2021. And the New York Times, Jenny Schuessler has been covering, she wrote a story on it. And she published the story, and it came out first online, and I heard from people, colleagues, et cetera. Then it came out in print, and that day I heard from someone in the Trump administration, or former Trump administration, that the president had read the article and that he liked the opportunity to speak to either me or all the authors to give his side of the story, he said. And gradually we worked out how this would work, and we decided to do it on Zoom instead of in person. It was just easier to get a lot of people, and we recorded it. And so I had a 1-hour meeting with him. About, I think, 10 of my contributors were able to join. He spoke for a half hour, and he basically, there were kind of, and you can see it, I published an article about this experience in The Atlantic, and the video is actually in the archives of Princeton, and they allowed The Atlantic to publish it. So it's online. It's on YouTube and everything. And it came out in I think it came out in 2021 or 2022. I can't remember. And then he took questions and answers. And, two things were clear for me just watching. This is my perspective. I mean, one, the issue that really he wanted to convey was what a great negotiator he was. Above everything else, he kind of went through 3 policy areas, and he really wanted to show how people didn't get what kinds of negotiations he had been involved in and how effective he had been, including with NATO and some other, including with South Korea. He talked about not what I expected. And then, the second part, which was really interesting to me, is he clearly felt at a certain level that he could persuade the historians about how to think of himself. It was the brander and the salesperson kind of thinking this is how it works. And I don't know, I guess the third part is he cared. Like, there's no need to call me and do an interview. I'm just some historian at Princeton, and, this was a book, it's published by an academic, but he really wanted to, so there is a kind of element of how he fits in history that he cares about. Anyway, that was the story. It was definitely the most unusual thing I've ever experienced, I think, in my career, but it's available for people to watch.
I'm Carol Lawson, a New York Times alum.
Nice to meet you.
Do you think the current efforts to redistrict congressional districts and limit voting rights are going to further impede efforts to improve what's going on in this country?
Yeah.
Or will it entrench Trump more?
They're very, so I've written a lot on voting rights to start with that, then move to redistricting, although they're connected. Look, there's a kind of a broad level, a kind of story of democracy where we are reversing where we were in 65. 65, the passage of the voting rights, is arguably one of the most important moments in the development of our democracy. And a law is passed, signed by Lyndon Johnson, that proves to be incredibly effective. Increases rates of black participation, elected presence on Capitol Hill and in all levels of government. And we've seen that erode. That's not a Trump story. The erosions happened since the 2010s, first with the Supreme Court decision, Shelby versus Holder in 2013, which already undercut Section 1 of voting rights. And now there's a case in the Supreme Court, which I heard someone say, what about the Supreme Court? And the Supreme Court's a big story with the Section 2. Combined, that's pretty devastating. So look, with redistricting, President Trump has effectively leaned on Republican state legislatures in Texas and I think in North Carolina now to essentially artificially expand the number of seats. And we live in an era of narrow majorities. I mean, that is the reality of modern politics. So when we're talking about midterms, what we're thinking about is small swings, not big ones. And so this could have a huge effect. It can certainly protect that Republican majority in the House. The erosion of voting rights, we think, historically will benefit Republicans, not Democrats, because a lot of those protections have been for Black American voters, Latino American voters. I know some of them swung toward the GOP in recent years, so it's not like it's a messy story. But in general, you could see how this might help bolster the power of rural, less populated conservative areas over urban, cosmopolitan, diverse areas. So again, I'm not someone to say democracy is done, not someone to say that he is ending elections. He is not, and we should not say that because he is not at this point, and the elections are happening. But that is an erosion of the progress of 1964, and it certainly, on paper, benefits Republicans. And redistricting, too. Democrats are in a bind. They don't have the same number of single-party states where they can count on this. And many Democratic states like New York, like California, passed rules to limit redistricting for good reasons. So now they have to overcome that if they're going to play the hardball that California is already trying to do.
Thank you. You've been very informative. Spencer Rumsey, Newsday, New York Newsday, blah, blah, blah. Our historian I heard give a lecture in Nassau, who is an expert on Mussolini, and answer a question about what's going on now, said, well, maybe in the worst case, we have 20 years of fascism. That's pretty bad. That's pretty pessimistic. What makes you, a historian of the moment, optimistic? Are there 3 or 4 things, or 5, that wake you up in the middle of the night saying, like, it's not so bad because of this?
So the optimistic parts, one is just my disposition. I'm optimistic. 2 is, look, it is true, and I'm always asked this when, I've been asked many times, have we had moments this bad or difficult in American history? And I think you can answer yes. We had a civil war, a literal civil war where the nation broke apart and lots of people died. We had the 1960s where there was a lot of political violence and division. I always caution that we shouldn't take the fact we've had difficult times as saying, all right, we're fine now. The point is, actually, we are more fragile than we think, and we can fall into these moments. But there is something good that people came out of those moments and kind of kept the country moving, moved us forward in good ways, and struggled, often, putting themselves on the line to make sure that we continued as a democracy. So the history does have that source of optimism. I also I think, and I'm probably not everyone agrees with me, but there's a lot of kind of signs of life in our democracy right now. That was a huge protest on Saturday. Huge. I mean, we're talking really a historic level, a number of people. It wasn't simply the numbers that came out. It was all across the country, red and blue, small and big cities. That, for me, I see that. And there is a kind of vibrant sign of life in the democracy, that not everyone is okay with how this is going. And people are doing something which in our day and age is intimidating. frankly. To go, I remember in the first No Kings in L.A., I was watching the news on cable, signal of my age, and but I remember an interview they did. I don't remember what channel or whatever, but it was with the daughter of an immigrant, and I'm just thinking, there she is on national TV. That was when there were troops in the city already, and she was just saying kind of how she. I mean, I don't remember exactly what she said, but it was essentially the person in the White House is the person we should have scrutiny on, not the people living in these cities. And that was a kind of act of bravery, a very just small moment. I was like, boy. And now that's only increased. I think more institutions are pushing back. I get how many media, university, and law firms caved, but many more are not. The president of Princeton he published a book. He's speaking every day about why we need to protect universities. Many universities, most didn't sign this compact that the president floated. Many law firms have not followed Paul Weiss, and they either took the administration to court or said, no, there is that. And so that gives me optimism because, I still think collectively when many people act, it can have an effect. And look, the last thing I'll say is I'm finishing a book now on the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the 1964 convention. It centers on civil rights activism. And as all of you know, remember, civil rights activists, spent decades to break the Jim Crow South. And that was a system of unmitigated violence and repression. And certainly wasn't a complete revolution, but it was a dramatic accomplishment. And so it's not only that we've had hard times, but we have a whole history of people, starting in the revolution, who have said no to dangerous exercises of political power and ultimately been victorious. All of that is why I still kind of believe in the country and where it can go.
Hi,
Hi.
Kevin McKenna, longtime editor at the New York Times and more recently, currently down the street at Baruch College. So I appreciate the importance you attach to the role of journalists over the last half century and more, going back to the Nixon era. And what you said about the evolution in the first Trump administration from sort of both sidesism to being willing to call a lie a lie. But I wonder if I could ask you for a minute to be a media critic and say, what about this current moment, platforms aside, but just in terms of substance, is the media either, what are its blind spots, what is it getting wrong, what is it failing to see, what is it, or in terms of news judgment and in terms of the way it's putting the news across?
I mean, so I'm not someone who's all negative on the news, so I start with it. I think there's been a lot of good coverage that gets slighted by critics. I think there's been stories on a lot of the issues we're talking about, whether it's the deportation, how it's working, or whether it is crypto. I think one issue for me always is the moving from one thing to another so quickly. When I look back and I read through the coverage of Watergate, it's incredible how sustained it is and ongoing, and just a kind of endurance of story that today for me sometimes feels it doesn't happen. It's like you move from, I can't even remember what was happening before the Bad Bunny Super Bowl controversy, but it was something big. I literally can't even remember, and I get it reflects the culture and the consumer, but I do think there's a quickness to trying to capture where the zeitgeist is going, rather than journalists trying to actually set some of the template for what the zeitgeist should be. That's a big one, and that plays into some of the dangerous elements, not just of the administration, but of politics in this day and age. Because we need that follow through. We need to say this is still happening. Look, a second one, there is an element, not everywhere, but the sensational triumphs sometimes. What's more important, and I do think in the competition to survive, frankly, not all outlets, but some are looking for stories that will sizzle. That will be easy to understand and catchy and sexy, even in a dangerous way. And I think that sometimes leads journalism, from what I see and read, or watch away from where it needs to be. And finally, I don't know. I mean, I do appreciate podcasts, actually. And I think the brevity of a lot of news coverage, which kind of combines with the quickness, sometimes undermines some of what it can do. One of the things podcasts have done well is it allows, within the span of a podcast, the conversation and the knowledge discussion, and good ones, to unfold. And you really get, you walk away with a much better understanding. But in an age of kind of very short, quick coverage, and I've been part of it on TV, it's hard to convey that. And these are enormous things we are facing. And you can't do it in a 30-second segment where, you know, you have video, your point, done. I just think that's not the way to do it. And those are three. There's more, but those are, and look, the big, look, and back to what I said, I do feel that the ownership kind of conflicts that we are now seeing front and center is a big problem. It's a problem for what is going to be allowed to be covered. Those walls that you all, most of you, you know, lived with and worked through don't seem as clear to me anymore. They're much more porous. And then once that wall is broken, politicians have immense leverage to scare the hell out of owners. And that's the fourth big problem for me.
Well, finally, for historians, you've covered the press.
Yes.
Will the biggest challenge be evaluating Trump's lies?
For historians, the biggest challenge is surviving. It's not covering his lies, meaning this is, look, I talked about the press, but I could give a whole lecture on the challenges history is facing, both as a discipline within universities that are under full-scale assault right now, financially, to things like what's happening at the Smithsonian, what's happening in the national parks, a national narrative about what should or should not be written about, which is totally disconnected from what we know about American history. Totally disconnected. So I start not with how will Trump be covered and how will we be able to disentangle outright lies from policy initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just more worried about what will the place of history, historians, and writing of complex, complicated, not always positive, not always negative history be 20, 30 years from now. It's the same kind of pressure the press is facing. And I still remain optimistic that we will figure a way out of it, but I think that's the threat that I start with, not about how to cover President Trump.
Well, thank you so much
Thank you.
once again. Yeah, this has been great.
Thank you.